What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content that I'm uploading onto my channel, then feel free to subscribe, and you can also offer suggestions on topics and characters and storylines and whatnot that we can have discussions on later on in this channel.
Okay, so Spider-Man Homecoming comes out in July. And after finishing The Incredible Hulk, a lot of people really seem to enjoy the idea of like long series, like picking a character, a team, or something like that, and just doing like an entire run, just covering like when one writer takes over the title and just does like a whole run. You know, Greg Pak's Incredible Hulk is a really good example. It's also the reason why, I think I'm gonna go ahead and dive into it, but it's also the reason why we're gonna do Jeff Johns' Green Lantern because it was so good. That's gonna take like a year and a half to finish. It's insane how long it is. But that's also why we're doing Injustice, is because, you know, they're really popular runs, people really enjoy them. I really enjoy them, and so I figured I'd go ahead and cover them. But with Spider-Man Homecoming coming out in July, I intended to do all new, all different Amazing Spider-Man, you know, when Spider-Man Homecoming came out. But after, you know, the idea of people loving The Incredible Hulk so much, I sat down and I said, okay, well, the issue with Spider-Man, all new, all different Amazing Spider-Man is the fact that it's basically just a continuation of Dan Slott's run from when he first took over the title. It's all just one great, big, huge, giant story. And so because of that, I kind of figured, well, I mean, why not go back and do Dan Slott's run? Because it really starts with Spider-Man big time, you know, taking Peter Parker back to his roots the way he should be in the eyes of Dan Slott and really in the eyes of a lot of fans, and then basically moving forward all the way through the events of Spider Island, all the way through the events of Superior Spider-Man, Spider-Verse, all that kind of stuff, and then basically ending with all new, or really kind of picking up with all new, all different Amazing Spider-Man by the time the movie comes out. That's what I'm shooting for here, and the way I have it scheduled, it should work out. You know, I mean, coming out every Monday, it would just be a Spider-Man video running up until all new, all different Amazing Spider-Man in July. But a couple things that I want to run over here as we get into this is really J. Michael Straczynski's run. I don't want to go super in-depth into it, but there are a few things that we need to highlight. First and foremost was One More Day. One More Day is one of the most divisive stories among Spider-Man fans. I mean, there are a lot of people that just hate it. They hate it. Usually it's because, you know, people who picked up Spider-Man before the events of One More Day. So they were reading about the marriage and the struggles and trials and tribulations between Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson. They came to identify with him. They loved the marriage between the two of them. I mean, Peter and Mary Jane Watson were never like Superman and Lois Lane level couple, but they were the most popular couple in Marvel Comics. They were kind of like Marvel's power couple in a lot of different ways. There were a few people who just hopped on the bandwagon. They just hated One More Day because it was the popular thing to do. But if you were one of those people who, you know, went back and read Spider-Man before the events of One More Day and then went through One More Day and picked up after, a lot of people hated it. But after the events of One More Day, there was Brand New Day. And Brand New Day basically said, here's the new starting point for Peter Parker. And people hated that just as much as they hated One More Day, because it basically said now, you know, Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson are no longer married. They basically ended their marriage by selling it off more or less to Mephisto in order to make sure that Aunt May lived. Because of the fact that she was dying at the time, it was granting Aunt May a new lease on life. Now, with Brand New Day going forward, Straczynski made a lot of changes. One of the first things he did is he took the character of Aunt May and said, okay, she's been single and alone long enough. You know, ever since, you know, Peter Parker was first introduced, Uncle Ben had died and she's basically been alone for the last 40 some odd years. Let's give her someone. And so what he did is he basically he paired her up with J. Jonah Jameson Sr., the father of J. Jonah Jameson, the head of Daily Bugle that hates Peter Parker. And so because of this, the two of them basically paired off. Fans, you know, there were fans who loved it, fans who hated it. It was kind of a mixed reaction. But then J. Michael Straczynski also got rid of the Daily Bugle. And the way he did this was by interjecting stories of J. Jonah Jameson having heart attacks, different things like that. But it was basically the idea that the Daily Bugle had been struggling. And so what happened was a financier, a guy by the name of Daniel Bennett, I think it was, came along and basically bought it. Now, it was done against the will of J. Jonah Jameson, and in fact, he was hospitalized at the time that it actually happened. Instead, it was really J. Jonah Jameson's wife, Marla, who engineered the selling of the Daily Bugle. But essentially, this more or less led to everybody being sent off. I mean, it was really people just not really being tied into the Daily Bugle. And so because of that, it was removed from the landscape in a lot of ways. But then we also had Peter Parker. Now, Peter Parker and J. Jonah Jameson, one of the cool things that Straczynski focused on was this notion that the two of them had this kind of respect. You know, J. Jonah Jameson always looked at Peter Parker as not really a surrogate son, but somebody that he had a lot of respect for. The issue with this was that when Peter Parker revealed his identity during the events of Civil War, J. Jonah Jameson flipped. He hit the roof. And what it did is it shattered the trust that he had in Peter Parker, and it more or less, you know, created a vendetta stronger than it had ever been between J. Jonah Jameson, Peter Parker, and Spider-Man. And so what happened is eventually Spider-Man basically saves the life of J. Jonah Jameson during an encounter with the Vulture, but a security guard had sacrificed his life in the process to, you know, try to protect Jameson. And while Jameson looked at the death death of the security guard and said that was honorable, that was a great thing that he did, Peter Parker doctored a photo to make it look like Jameson had fought off the Vulture. And so what happened is Jameson took this as an affront and said, basically, you're insulting the identity of the security guard, you're insulting the memory of the security guard who basically saved my life. And so Peter Parker was essentially ousted from the Daily Bugle. And so that's why he's currently unemployed when it comes to this. So there were a couple things that were introduced here and there, and we'll cross that bridge when we get to. But with regards to Spider-Man Big Time, this is really, again, Dan Slott making Peter Parker his own. Now keep in mind, this is all after the events of Civil War, so on and so forth. You know, Steve Rogers has already returned to the landscape. And so what this does is it gives us the Avengers, really the mighty Avengers as it exists right now, with Thor, Jessica Drew, Spider-Woman, Iron Man, Wolverine, Captain America, Hawkeye, so on and so forth. And they're basically responding to the robots of Dr. Octopus wreaking havoc in New York. Now, this is really Dan Slott leading up to the events of Superior Spider-Man when Otto Octavius took over the body of Peter Parker. That's one of the reasons why a lot of people loved the early run of Dan Slott, because there were so many plot threads that started in Big Time and extended out into everything, and it took, 4 or 5 years in order for it to all come to fruition. But when it did, it felt rewarding. It felt like this great, big, huge, incredible experience. And so really with the various superheroes going through and fighting against, these guys, we pick up with J. Jonah Jameson and again with Marla. Now, of course, because of the trials and tribulations they'd experienced, they were going through couples counseling, different things like that. But again, it's really just Dan Slott saying, hey, here's where we reside. We have J. Jonah Jameson as mayor right now. We have him and Marla dealing with family issues, dealing with couple issues. It's again, taking the stories very much back to the grounded level of traditional superheroes and traditional characters as we knew them, albeit in some slightly different roles. But what we do at this point is we pick up with Captain America. Now, within this story, this is really just kind of a not really a side plot, but kind of a side thing, but it really ties into Dr. Octopus. But this is a small version of what I'm talking about when I talk about, instances where Dan Slott's building into bigger things, because this is not actually Steve Rogers. Instead, what happens is Steve Rogers tells this guy who's standing guard with regards to this Vertex shuttle to basically go away, to say, hey, look, you're relieved of guard duty. I'm going to go ahead and take over here just because of the fact that this is one of the most important artifacts that we have right now. Not anyone can just keep an eye on it. Now, of course, the other cool thing here is Dan Slott builds on the legacy of Captain America. And that's one of the interesting things here is in Marvel Comics, you have characters that are interchangeable and you have characters that are concrete, characters that do not change. Some characters that are interchangeable might be like Moon Knight, for example. Different writers can take a different view of the character, write him differently, bring in characters, remove characters, things like that. Steve Rogers is not that way. He's a concrete character and he's always the guy who's like, freedom above all else. He always fights for freedom. He never fights for anything other than freedom. That's the biggest reason why the change of Steve Rogers becoming a Hydra agent during All New, All Different Marvel was so controversial, is because there were a lot of people who were clinging on to these old stories and didn't want to see the Steve Rogers concept move forward, didn't really want to see it change. They wanted him to stay Captain America, and rightfully so, because people latch on to different aspects of different characters as time goes on, and the one that they love the most is the one that they don't want to see change. So it's natural to have that kind of response. But again, picking back up with Peter Parker, we basically joined with the arrival of Felicia Hardy. Now, she doesn't get a whole lot of screen time here in the opening salvo for Big Time. She actually becomes important later on down the line. But again, she's just one of the funny members, one of the members of the Spider family, so to speak. But there's also a little banter back in here. And again, this is really just Dan Slott saying, hey, Felicia Hardy, she's one of the characters that you all know and love. She's definitely going to play a major role in the story. It's always kind of fun to see. But the other funny thing here is she arrives on the scene to help Peter Parker, bail him out of an otherwise dangerous situation. And she's like, yeah, so what's the chances of me becoming an Avenger? And Peter Parker, of course, is like, none. There's no chance of you becoming an Avenger. There's not a single solitary chance. Sorry about your luck. But again, from here, the cool thing, and one of the things that I love the most about Dan Slott's writing when it came to this opening, this opening thing, was really the idea of how Peter Parker sees himself. Because what he does is he sits down and he says, hey, look, I basically have a new life going on now. I'm with my new girlfriend, Carly Cooper. I'm not with Mary Jane Watson anymore. He talks about the idea of Aunt May being in a relationship with J. Jonah Jameson Sr., but he also addresses himself in relation to other superheroes. He says he's not a heavy hitter like Thor. He's not one of the big time geniuses like Reed Richards or Tony Stark. But that's the irony of this, is that he very much is. Peter Parker is extremely smart. He's one of the smartest men out there. And it's really this sort of humble nature that people like, where he doesn't sit down and say, yeah, I'm one of the smartest people out there. It's always the idea that in his mind, there's always someone smarter. There's always someone out there that's capable of more. But we as the reader know that that's not really the case, that Spider-Man is one of the smartest people out there. Now, at this point, we pick back up again with Andrew Air Force Base. And again, this is basically the chameleon who is masquerading as Steve Rogers. And the reason why is because they're basically carrying out a mission on behalf of Dr. Octopus. Now again, this is Dr. Octopus setting the stage for some much grander plans later on down the line. He's basically implementing his own scheme on the side. This entire conflict here is essentially designed to be a distraction. Not only that, Dr. Octopus actually has a lot of respect for Peter Parker. And this is why I say this is Dan Slott setting the stage for Dr. Octopus taking over the mind of Peter Parker during Superior Spider-Man. Because what he says is, at this moment right now, Peter Parker is really, really smart. But Dr. Octopus also recognizes that a time will come, or at least in this almost immediate moment, that Peter Parker is going to find a way to basically deactivate all these different bombs that he has planted inside these devices around New York. And this is why I say that Peter Parker is just as smart as Reed Richards and Tony Stark, because what he does is he sits down and says, oh my God, I figured out what's going on, because in their mind, in the mind of Reed Richards and Stark and so on, this countdown's going. And when it reaches zero, all these bombs are going to go off and New York is going to vanish off the face of the earth. But what Peter Parker realizes is that it's the first day of November, that it's basically daylight savings time. And so, Dr. Octavius or Dr. Octopus had taken this into account, that when Peter Parker figured out what was going on, that he would be able to set the timer back and give them an extra hour. Now, this of course allows Peter Parker and the various members of the Avengers to get these bombs out of here. But again, this was all just designed to be a ruse. It was designed to keep them focused on this one thing so that Dr. Octopus could implement his own plans. And what we'll find out with those plans will be later on. But from here, we transition to Frontline. Now, again, this is all part of the post-Civil War landscape. Remember, Frontline came to prominence with Ben Urich and Sally Floyd during Civil War, and it got a lot of popularity because it was basically covering the events of Civil War from the perspective of reporters, from non-superheroes, basically. And because of that, Ben Urich and Sally Floyd eventually left the Daily Bugle where they originally started out. They took the Frontline concept with them, basically this online posting source, and they launched their own publication house called Frontline. And that's what's happening with a lot of people here. A lot of folks like Robbie Robertson, they are all taking up residence as part of Frontline in place of the Daily Bugle. And so because of that, we again pick back up with Peter Parker. And the funny thing about this is, again, during Dan Slott's run, there was a girl named Michelle, and she had essentially become Peter Parker's roommate to a degree, and they really had a relationship, although it was more of a physical one, really, than an actual, we love each other on a solid scale. But this just came by way of Michelle's brother, being convicted of a crime, and her keeping an eye on her brother's place while he was gone. Peter Parker, of course, having been roommates with her brother before he was incarcerated. But this is, again, Dan Slott wrapping all these things up and axing all these things, removing them from the landscape. Because what happens is Peter comes home and Michelle's like, yeah, I'm going back to Chicago now because my brother's out. And so, that's pretty much it. And so Peter Parker is more or less just kind of left to call around to different people and see if he can find a roommate, see if he can find a place to take up residence. Now, that's the cool thing here, is because this is Peter Parker just struggling with everyday things. He's like, well, my roommate's gone, so I got to find a new place. And he's got to do it quick, fast, and in a hurry. Of course, he goes to Carly, but their relationship is still pretty new. And so she's like, look, we more or less just started dating not too long ago. I'm not really comfortable with moving in. And so she basically says no, which is kind of messed up. Of course, he goes to Flash Thompson, and Flash Thompson's like, no, that's not going to happen, man. Like, you're not going to live with me. And he even goes to Mary Jane Watson. And the funny thing about this is Dan Slott, it was really kind of a funny moment, because it was like Dan Slott was toying with fans. It's like he was trolling Mary Jane Watson fans. Like, hey, you know how you guys really, really want to see Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson get back together? And fans are like, yeah. And he's like, well, that's not going to happen. And so like that, he ends up having to leave. He ends up walking away, when the two of them agree not to be roommates together. And so ultimately he goes to Aunt May. Now, the cool thing about this is that Aunt May was already spending time, or at least already hanging out with the son of J. Jonah Jameson, along with J. Jonah Jameson Sr., the two of them, spending time with one another, hanging out, as well as a woman by the name of Dr. Madison Jameson. Now, the reason why Madison Jameson matters here is because Aunt May was telling her about Peter Parker, saying, hey, Peter Parker's a genius. He's one of the smartest people on the face of the planet. And so by the time Peter Parker arrives, starts knocking on the door of Aunt May and says, hey, would it be possible for me to crash here? Dr. Madison says, actually, your Aunt May's basically said that you're a genius. And I know of a guy who's very good at dealing with geniuses. And so what happens is Peter Parker is taken to Horizon Labs. Now, for those of you guys who were reading All New, All Different Amazing Spider-Man, and the first story arc saw the marriage of Max Modell and his significant other, what this was a continuation of this whole Horizon Labs story. This is where all this starts, is this whole Horizon Labs thing. It's the introduction of this. We kind of get the kicker. And that's why I really wanted to cover this. It's really exciting. You guys will basically get everything that led to All New, All Different Amazing Spider-Man from the ground up. Like, you guys get it from the very beginning, which is why it's so cool. But Horizon Labs, as it's led by Max Modell, is like Peter Parker's playground. That's the best way to describe it. Max Modell, according to Peter Parker, was really his idol in a lot of different ways. I mean, Peter looked to Reed Richards, he looked to Tony Stark. Yeah, they're really smart, they're capable of great things. But in his mind, Max Modell was the guy to aspire to. Not only that, we get the introduction of a really cool guy named Grady Scraps. And I love Grady Scraps. But the gist of this is that Horizon Labs is essentially a think tank for some of the smartest people in the Marvel universe. That's really all it is it's a think tank for all these geniuses. And so it's a chance for them to just kind of run free and do whatever they want to. Now, what Max Modell says is that the way this is done, or the way Horizon Labs functions, is different than like Reed Richards' Future Foundation. It's different than like Tony Stark's whole initiative. The idea isn't to necessarily say, all right, guys, your assignment is to focus on this one thing and then go from there. It's basically, hey, do whatever you want to do. Like, just create whatever you want to create. Just get carried away, let your imagination run wild, because creativity only really comes when there is no constraint here, when there's no, confinement here. And so what ends up happening is we basically pick up with a woman named Sajani Joffrey, who's basically trying to create an artificial version of vibranium. Now, the reason why she's doing this is because this story takes place after an event called Doom War. And Doom War was a story where Dr. Doom invaded Wakanda for the purpose of capturing its vibranium. Now, while, Wakanda, its citizens are basically placed under control, they were dominated, that kind of thing, Black Panther and his sister Shuri were the only ones who remained out of the influence of this sphere of control. And so in the end, it was, they were successful in casting out Dr. Doom. But in the process, Black Panther basically rendered all the vibranium across the world inert. And so this had two effects. The first is that all vibranium everywhere, which had the mystical property of absorbing kinetic energy, it basically rendered all that obsolete. And so now vibranium was essentially worthless. The other effect was that because vibranium was basically worthless, Wakanda had no real value anymore. And so what's happening is people are basically scrambling to try to find vibranium, trying to find a way to duplicate it. And that's really what's happening here. The issue is that Sajani's created something called reverbium. Instead of absorbing sound, instead of absorbing energy, it reflects it and it amplifies it. And so essentially it's like turning the whole thing into a tuning fork. And that's really what happens here. As soon as it's activated, it's just like infinite amplification of sound to the point that it threatens to bring the entire building crashing down around it. Now, of course, Peter Parker is able to shut the system down. And so what happens is he's kind of given this pop quiz by Max Modell. The funny thing about this is that when they ask him questions like, well, we've developed an anti-gravity harness, what do we use for a braking system? When he's asked questions like, how do you contain a 3D object or a 2D object in a 3D space? When they're talking about how do, we've discovered some alien fungus, how do you slow its growth? He references his own experiences here. When he's dealing with Vulture, when he's dealing with Venom, he's referencing his own experience and going against these various villains and how he was able to defeat them. And so really it's him bringing his own experience to the table. And this is Dan Slott saying, no, Peter Parker's a genius. He's one of the smartest people out there. And so from here, it's really Spider-Man hitting the big time. It's the idea that he's finally experiencing success. He's finally having things go his way. And so as this little bit begins to wrap up, we're basically brought back, or at least we're reintroduced to the character of Roderick Kingsley, also known as the Hobgoblin. Now, the cool thing about the Hobgoblin is that he was actually created by Roger Stern to basically be a replacement for the Green Goblin. The way it worked out is in 1971, Jerry Conway had written a story called The Night Gwen Stacy Died, and that was the death of Gwen Stacy. It was one of the most landmark stories in the history of Peter Parker. But basically, it ended with the death of the Green Goblin. The issue was that Green Goblin was so popular by that point, or at least the idea of, Gwen Stacy dying because of either the actions of the Green Goblin or Spider-Man was such a controversial topic that's still being debated to this day, that Marvel wanted to bring the Green Goblin back. But at the time, with Roger Stern writing Amazing Spider-Man, his idea was, I do not want to bring the Green Goblin back from the dead. Instead, I'm going to create somebody else and enter the Hobgoblin. Now, there have been different people who have played the role of Hobgoblin, and they've all had different aspects of the character that made them all unique. But for the character of Kingsley, and really for Hobgoblin as a whole, while he has come into contact with Peter Parker on several occasions, he always really seemed more like a mercenary than anything else, kind of like a soldier of fortune, in the sense that he would just take contracts, he would implement those contracts, and that would be it. Now, with regards to the Hobgoblin as he exists right now, he's been contracted by Kingpin, and the reason for this is because Kingpin, has sources on the inside, there's guys on the inside of Horizon Labs, and Kingpin comes to the realization that, Joffrey's basically working on reverbium, and Kingpin basically says, hey, look, if this is a metal that can amplify sound, then what we're going to do is we're going to steal it, and we're literally going to weaponize it and then sell it to any government that wants to buy it. Again, it's really just, it's just pure money grubbing here when it comes to Kingpin. Kingpin. That's really all that's really all this aspect of the story is. But what happens is Kingsley travels to what used to be the domain of Norman Osborn, because keep in mind, this is after the events of Dark Reign, this is after the events of Siege, and so Norman Osborn is no longer a main character. Instead, he's very much just gone from the public eye. And so because of that, when Kingsley actually gets into Norman Osborn's lab and starts going through his personal things, he's met by Phil Urich. Now, Phil Urich is one of the people who was associated with the Daily Bugle, and his whole idea is that he's basically the nephew of the now famous Ben Urich, who did so much reporting during the events of Civil War. But what happens is Phil Urich, while he's being attacked by a Hobgoblin, essentially just freaks. Now with Phil Urich, the funny thing about him is that he was a Goblin at one point in time. In fact, he was the Green Goblin during the events of the Onslaught saga, so it's not like he's brand new to all this. He's not a creation by Dan Slott. Instead, for the character of Phil Urich, this is a return to familiarity in a lot of different ways, except now he's taking on the role of Hobgoblin. Now, as far as I'm aware, the only Goblin role that Phil Urich played up to this point was the Green Goblin. I may be wrong, although I don't think I am, but if I am, feel free to correct me down there. But as far as I'm aware, he was only ever the Green Goblin. But taking over the role of Hobgoblin, what's really interesting about this is that it really shines into effect the nature of the Kingpin, in the sense that Kingpin doesn't really care who it is that fulfills a contract, as long as what he's trying to acquire is brought in. As long as what it is that he's looking for is brought to him. Now, at this point, we basically pick up in City Hall. And again, this is really kind of funny here because J. Jonah Jameson still hates the idea of Spider-Man. I mean, he's always going to hate Spider-Man. And what's kind of cool is Captain America shows up and says, hey, look, I really want Spider-Man to receive, like, you're doing the whole honorary thing of the key to the city. I really think Spider-Man should be the one to get this. Now, this immediately strikes, this immediately strikes J. Jonah Jameson as, no, that's not going to happen. I absolutely hate Spider-Man. I'm not going to give it to him. I'm going to give it to my son. Now, the funny thing about this is that his son shows up, and he says, hey, I would love to have the key to the city, but I really do think it needs to go to Spider-Man because he's done so many great deeds. So it's not the most significant thing in the world. It's just kind of funny to see J. Jonah Jameson being put in such a strange situation. But again, picking back up again with Horizon Labs, this is when we really start to get this full explanation from Max Modell, in the sense that we're introduced to a few other characters here and there, a few more members, which is part of the Elite Seven, or the not really like the Secret Seven, but it's part of like the top 7 people who were there, the ones that can come and go as they please, work on whatever it is that they want to. And Peter Parker is basically given his own lab. He's given the ability to work on whatever it is that he wants to work on. The issue with this is that while he's in the middle of studying, while he's in the middle of reading what he needs to read and try to get things in order, the entire Horizon Labs facility is immediately attacked by the Hobgoblin. Now, this is actually kind of cool because Dan Slott was messing around with us a little bit. I mean, we would sit here and we would think, well, these are some of the smartest people on the face of the planet. And so if Peter Parker's suddenly not there and Spider-Man is there, then it would seem like the easiest thing to figure out, or the easiest thing to understand, or to, come to the conclusion of, is that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. Not only that, remember, Phil Urich has his, Goblin scream, so to speak, which basically, it wreaks all kinds of havoc in the sense that it's basically a sonic scream. And so because of this, it incapacitates Peter Parker, it causes physical reactions in the sense that he's bleeding out of his eyes, and so what happens is, in the middle of this conflict, Peter Parker is able to make his escape by the skin of his pants. Max Modell yanks the fire alarm, and what it does is it kind of balances things out a bit, in the sense that it more or less sends, the Hobgoblin off, just kind of running for the middle of nowhere. Spider-Man, of course, chases after him, and it's kind of this cat and mouse game. And the sense that Spider-Man's trying to figure out why Hobgoblin's come back. He's trying to figure out while he's there, but in the end, it doesn't really matter because Hobgoblin's able to make off with this reverbium as it's been created by Sajani Joffrey. And so one of the funny moments here, this is why I love this so much, is at this point, once it's all said and done, we have Captain Watanabe of the New York Police Department that shows up. And of course, Peter Parker, changing out of his Spider-Man uniform, has to come up with an excuse for why it is that he wasn't out there, when one of the people was like, hey, I took a head count and Peter Parker's not here. When they go into his lab, he's wearing headphones and he's naked. And his response is that, well, this is how I function. Like, I put headphones on, I listen to music, I study when I'm naked. It was the only excuse that he could come up with, spur of the moment. And this is why so many fans loved Peter Parker, because it was just small moments like this that were absolutely hilarious. It was small moments like this that were amazing. But at this point, we pick up with Hobgoblin joining Wilson Fisk. And this is why I say Wilson Fisk doesn't really care what goes on with a contract. Instead, he says, where's Roderick Kingsley? Like, where's Kingsley at? And the response of Phil Urich Hobgoblin is, it doesn't really matter. Like, it doesn't matter at all. I mean, he's gone, he's dead, but the contract's been fulfilled. And Kingpin says, cool beans. Now, the funny thing is he doesn't really trust Kingsley that much. He's not really sure how he feels about him, but he did uphold the contract. He did fulfill what it was that Kingpin was looking for, and that's all he ever really cares about. Now, at this point, we rejoin Black Cat, and that's why I say she was going to have more of a significant role later on in the story, and I love what Dan Slott does with this. Historically speaking, there's always been this sort of cat and mouse game, not to make a pun, but there's always been this sort of cat and mouse game between Peter Parker and Black Cat, in the sense that it was always this sort of will they, won't they kind of thing. You know, like, are they ever going to get together? Are they ever going to actually have any real measure of an ongoing relationship? And that's really what Dan Slott does here. He toys with the notion there's a lot of sexual tension between the two of them and a lot of jokes that go on between the two of them. But at the end of the day, it's always Peter Parker saying, hey, this is why we don't date. This is why we don't get together. But what Black Cat also says is that by way of her sources, she's come to the realization, or she's been informed, that the buyer of the reverbium that was stolen from Horizon Labs is Kingpin. And so this really brings Spider-Man back into contact with Wilson Fisk again. Now, at this point, he says, of course, meet me at this location. The two of them end up getting together, and a box just lands behind Black Cat. When she opens it up, there's glasses, there's an earpiece, the glasses say put this on, or the goggles say put this on. When she does, she realizes that Peter Parker has a new suit, that he basically has a stealth suit. And what he says is this suit is designed to eliminate sound and eliminate people being able to see him, in the sense that it minimalizes all of it. And so, or I guess minimizes all of it. And so it's really his own stealth variation of what Tony Stark had done before, where he had made a stealth suit. And so this basically allows them to infiltrate Kingpin's base of operations in Shadowland and attempt to try to retrieve the reverbium. Now, something else to keep in mind here is that at this point, again, Phil Urich as Hobgoblin is very much in the employ of Kingpin, not to mention that Kingpin himself also has, members of the Hand. Now, something that I want to point out here is that the Hand is this really clandestine organization of ninjas based out of Japan that go back quite some time. But overall, the gist is twofold when it comes to the Hand. The first is to infiltrate various, governmental agencies, subvert them from the inside out, operate from the shadows, that kind of thing. But they're basically also for hire, in the sense that if you have enough money, you can pay members of the Hand to carry out assassinations. Woe betide you if you don't pay them, but you can you can hire them for the purpose of making assassinations, being bodyguards, things like that. And that's kind of the interesting thing, is because the Hand are some of the best assassins in the entirety of the Marvel Universe. And so if you have them as bodyguards, you're almost guaranteed to stay safe, only with the exception of a few people here and there who can basically subvert them. Wolverine is a good example, Elektra is a good example, different things like that. But in the midst of all this, with Hobgoblin, basically responding to what seems to be a break-in with, Peter Parker arriving here along with Black Cat actually leaves Peter hanging. She kind of bails out in the middle of it and says, hey, I was here to help you get this, but I'm literally a cat burglar, and I know a losing game when I see one, so you're on your own. And she says, all I'm going to do is go to, Wilson Fisk's personal office, steal some of his private collection, and then sell it. Of course, Wilson Fisk's head of security, so to speak, figures out what's going on with Black Cat. He's able to subdue her. And when she's in the clutches of Kingpin, the funny thing about this is that, Peter Parker's suit is designed to block out all methods of communication. Not only that, Hobgoblin had basically used his sonic scream in order to overpower the stealth suit, or the stealth aspect of Peter Parker's suit, which he responds in kind by, again, basically blocking out all sound in order to keep the Hobgoblin sonic scream from affecting him. But the issue here is that he's oblivious to what's going on with regards to Felicia Hardy. He has no idea what's happening with regards to her being taken by the Kingpin. And so in the end, what really ends up happening here is just a matter of circumstance that leads to Felicia Hardy, getting free, Spider-Man being able to make his escape, in the sense that the sonic scream of Hobgoblin reflects off the reverbium and literally begins to start bringing the building crashing down around him. And so, of course, Peter's able to jump in. He's able to save Felicia. He goes against the Kingpin for a little while, but that's really about it. I mean, he really just kind of whisks out of there, and he calls it a day. And so in response, we basically wrap this section up with Dan Slott kind of, leaving us a bit of a taste for what comes next when we have Phil Urich meeting with everybody at the Daily Bugle, Robbie Robertson and all these guys back in the Daily Bugle again, as well as him basically being the inside man, in the sense that he essentially knows everything that's going on when it comes to the Daily Bugle. He knows what Peter Parker's individual actions are, despite not knowing that Peter and Spider-Man are one and the same. It's really always him just kind of operating from the shadows. And what Dan Slott's basically doing is drawing a parallel between Peter Parker and Hobgoblin Phil Urich, in the sense of saying that, in a lot of ways, Phil Urich is this sort of Peter Parker antithesis, in the sense that Peter Parker was working as a Daily Bugle with a dual identity. He was Peter Parker, he was Spider-Man, he was selling photos to the Daily Bugle to show what it was that he was doing, or at least to show what Spider-Man was doing. That's how he was making his money. Hobgoblin is doing much the same thing, except instead of making money, he's using it to bolster his reputation. Meanwhile, Peter Parker has basically moved on from the Daily Bugle, and he's taking up residence in Horizon Labs, where he's basically making his money now, and he's making a lot of it. But this really kind of ends with the idea of, basically Peter Parker's all new apartment. It's essentially Dan Slott saying, here's where we are now. Peter Parker's got his own place. He's got his own girlfriend that's not Mary Jane Watson, that for him, all is right with the world. And it lives up to the title Spider-Man Big Time in the sense that Peter Parker has finally hit the big time. He's finally stepped into what he considers to be a successful career, that he's no longer scrounging by selling photographs to the Daily Bugle. Instead, he's got a legitimate career path. His intelligence is being used adequately. He really considers himself to have finally arrived. But with that being said, guys, I know this was a lengthy video, but when it came to Dan Slott's Spider-Man Big Time, there was a lot to cover. There were a few things that I kind of had to leave out here and there just because of the fact that, really for time constraints, otherwise this would have ended up being a 45-minute long video. I know some of you guys like those 45-minute long videos. I'm not going to make a 45-minute long video. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.